Hello, and welcome to Real Mindful. This is where we speak mindfully about things that matter. We're here twice a month to introduce you to some of the teachers, thinkers, writers, and researchers who are engaged in the mindfulness movement. You'll hear all kinds of conversations on this podcast about the science of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, and the heart of it. I'm Stephanie Domet. I'm the managing editor at Mindful Magazine and mindful.org, and this is Real Mindful. Today on the podcast, my guest is Dr. Amishi Jha. Amishi has been featured many times in Mindful and on mindful.org for her work with so-called high-stress cohorts like first responders and military service members. We spoke with her in the early days of the pandemic about the acronym VUCA, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. She told us how our brains react to VUCA circumstances and how mindfulness can help us regain ownership of our attention. You can read an excerpt from her new book, Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 Minutes a Day, in the December issue of Mindful Magazine, which is on newsstands now. Amishi and I connected a few weeks ago for a Mindful Live session, and we're pleased to bring you that conversation on Real Mindful today. For now, I'm very pleased to welcome Amishi Jha to Mindful Live. Amishi is a neuroscientist and a professor of psychology at the University of Miami. She's the author of Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 Minutes a Day, which has just been published by Harper One. Amishi's research focuses on the brain bases of attention, working memory, and mindfulness-based training. She was selected as a Science and Public Leadership Fellow by PopTech, and she serves on editorial review boards of Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, Journal of Experimental Psychology General, Frontiers in Cognitive Science, and Frontiers in Psychology. She is a regular contributor to Mindful and mindful.org, and as a person who's currently struggling with focus, I could not be more glad to have Amishi here today for this conversation. Amishi, hello, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's so great to be here with you, Stephanie.
So I mentioned that I've been struggling with focus, and Amishi, I wouldn't be surprised if every interview you've done around this book has started with a similar admission from the host. How common is the struggle?
Oh, very, very common. And I would say it's at the point where it feels like a crisis moment collectively. I think that probably already in the ramp up before the pandemic, so to speak, the notion of being constantly on call, we're reachable 24/7, and having a serious industry effort from social media companies to create algorithms that are not only there to capture, but really mine our attention contributes to all of that. I think the pandemic kind of put it over the top, though, for many of us because of the nature of what we faced, the kind of challenge, difficulty, uncertainty, etc. So you're not alone, but there is some good news. And the first piece of good news that I really do want to acknowledge and that I really love to give people is it's not your fault. I think the problem ends up being when people truly personalize the challenges that they experience. I just can't pay attention. It's my brain that's the problem. And no, I think that for the most part, the response we're having is very normal and in fact indicative of a very well-functioning attention system. If you feel pulled by things that are intended to pull you, well, your attention's doing what it's supposed to do. If you have a preoccupation with things that are life-threatening, like a global pandemic and a deadly virus, that's appropriate. That's exactly what we should be doing. The hard part is trying to juggle all of that and trying to live what we consider sort of normal life. That's where it feels like a crisis. But I think knowing that there's nothing intrinsically problematic with us is important. And then the other piece of really good news, which that's why I'm always thrilled to talk and do anything with mindful.org, is because the reality is there's something we can do. There's actions we can take. We can actually solve a lot of this crisis experience through training we can provide ourselves and through resources that are available to guide us to do that, like those available on this platform.
That is all good news. And even with what I know about mindfulness and about the brain, uh, just hearing you say, we tend to think it's our fault. And I think this all the time. Why can't I focus?
Yeah.
And the answer, of course, if a friend said that to me, I would say because we're in a global pandemic. That it does make it tough to pay attention. And there is so much that can fracture our attention, especially right now, as you say, not just social media, but then
Yeah.
we've talked with you about this before, the way that volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations play havoc with our ability to really focus our attention. Certainly, we have been in an extended VUCA period. How does the relentlessness of all this act on our attention?
Right. So I think the first thing to acknowledge, I guess, just in terms of my own background, is these are exactly the kind of circumstances that my lab has been studying for about 15 years now. Most of our work is with populations like first responders, military service members, military spouses, medical and nursing professionals. And part of my motivation in wanting to study those groups is because the nature of the nature of the circumstances when they are to perform at their best is characterized by the exact circumstances that are likely to deplete and degrade attention. And you describe those perfectly. VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain. V, volatile, U, uncertain, C, complex, A, ambiguous. So, and that term is one coined by the U.S. Army War College. And it's not just that these individuals will experience that, it's that, like, you should show up at your best. We don't want a surgeon that's distracted during emergency surgery. We don't want a first responder. We don't want a firefighter feeling distracted when there's a 4-alarm fire going on. So we expect this of certain populations, and that's what motivated us to start looking into solutions. I had no idea, fast forward, 12 years later, that we'd all be in that position. But the reality is what we saw in the lab over and over again, which troubled me enough to want to then find solutions, is that for populations like the professions that I mentioned, when we tapped in and tracked their attention, so we had them do laboratory-based experiments where we wanted to see how well are they performing on attentionally demanding tasks. So they do these tasks, we get objective metrics or even sometimes brain metrics. And then several weeks later, we'd have them do the same thing again, same kind of battery of metrics. And if the interval between when we tested them, 2 to 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes even longer, if that involved these kind of circumstances, the very VUCA type circumstances, attention significantly and reliably declined. And it didn't really matter. So it didn't matter necessarily if the nature of that demand was life-threatening or even high stakes from an outsider's point of view. So, for example, even undergraduates over the course of the academic semester who report increasing experience of stress will have less well-functioning attention at the end of the semester relative to the beginning of the semester. So that's just the reality of what happens. Now, the unfortunate side, which ends up turning it into a crisis, even if attention is behaving as it should because it's responding to the stress by engaging itself over and over, is for undergrads, for example, they still have to perform on final exams. Or for military service members, we saw this during pre-deployment. They're still going to be deployed. And for all of us during the pandemic, where we're experiencing these circumstances, we still have to perform can't not be parenting our children and doing our work and, showing up in the ways that we need to for family and friends. So that ends up being a problem. I don't know. Does that answer your question, Stephanie?
It answers a lot of questions. I mean,
sorry.
that our attention can easily be frayed.
Yeah.
Stress, and then when we're under stress for an extended period of time, more so.
That's right. And kind of to dig in a little bit in a more granular way, it's like, what is it about these VUCA circumstances that's so problematic?
Yeah.
Well, we find out from, again, laboratory-based studies, if we have somebody come into the lab and have them do an attentionally demanding task, and we just take the kind of cold cognitive tasks, so for example, something as simple as you're going to sit in front of a screen, every time you see a number, press a button, except when that number is 3. Really boring experiment, but the numbers aren't hard to see. It's just that the threes, the ones that they're not supposed to press to, happen infrequently.
Mm-hmm.
So they're sitting there pressing the button, boring, boring, boring. Their mind starts to wander. They're not thinking about even what's on the screen. Soon enough, if a three shows up and they press the button. So people are bad at this. I mean, and there's nothing going on that's particularly problematic. It's just their own mind wandering will occur. And that's very well known. About 50% of our waking moments, our mind will wander away from the task at hand. And if you take that same experiment now and add in just news media images, so these could be neutral images or potentially negative images that we see on our phones every day, all the time, you just embed them in this experiment. All of a sudden now the amount of wandering increases and the performance starts to tank further. So even in the context of a single experiment, not even a high-stress lived circumstance, you see this. And we do this with various kinds of stimuli, which has led us to the understanding that the things that really do seem to be like kryptonite in some sense for attention are things like stress, meaning the experience of overwhelm, negative mood, which is really kind of described by those negative images that I was talking about a moment ago, and threat. So stress, negative mood, threat tend to be sort of the big three. And we see this when we embed those kind of images or stimuli into an experiment in the moment, or when we have people that experience those kind of circumstances over multiple periods, over multiple weeks. And the answer for why they are so problematic for attention seems to really be around this notion of mind wandering. So having these off-task thoughts, when we see something that's problematic, like a negative image, we're hijacked away from the moment. And we're either thinking about a past circumstance that might kind of remind us of that, or something in the future. And what happens with that is when our mind wanders, our attention wanders away with it. So it's no longer available in the moment. And that's why it feels like we can't have access to it. It's actually not here for us to have access to. It's hijacked away.
And we've all been living in those circumstances for the last couple of years, right? So,
yeah. But I wanted to say one other thing about that, because it sounds very depressing, actually, sort of boost my own mood and to remind everybody else, because, it feels a little hopeless when we say it that way. It's like, okay, I can't lead a life where I just never have stress, threat, negative mood. I wish I could. And in my life, even if I'm not experiencing high stress right now, even in the context of the pandemic, if we say, well, we're at some steady state, the rate at which people are kind of coming out of this, the worst of it is hopefully on the uptick. Is there anything that we can do? Are we really is this just the nature of how things are going to go? But I'll tell you that even for those soldiers, even for those first responders, for the students also, all these groups that we had studied in the lab, when we offer them mindfulness training exercises during the high stress intervals, and they start practicing during the high stress intervals, they don't decline in their attention. They actually stay stable over time, which is kind of amazing. That's what, to me, resilience looks like. And I would even use the term not resilience, but presilience. We're protecting, if you say resilience is, in some sense, bouncing back from adversity and challenge. Presilience is not needing to bounce back. You're staying steady. Mm. And what kind of amazes me is that this is what just people practicing a few minutes every day on their own can do for their own mind, which is the hopeful part.
Yeah, I mean, that is great. And I had my own experience of this that I want to share with you. I used to have a really demanding job, a different demanding job from the one I currently have. I was the host of a daily 3-hour current affairs radio show. So it was very fast-paced, very demanding. Wow. And when I left that job after 8 or 9 years and tried to return to the novel I was writing, I found that my basic attention span was just smashed to smithereens. I'd grown so used to splintering my attention, one eye on Twitter, reading background on one guest while interviewing another live on the radio, listening to my producer in my headphones with one ear, changing tasks on a dime. And I was rewarded, right, for being able to do that. That's what my job required. And I'm really good at fracturing my own attention. But when I tried to get back to the quieter work of writing a novel, which requires the exact opposite of all of that, I couldn't stay on task for even 5 minutes at a time. And I had to use a little kitchen timer to retrain myself to just sit and focus on my writing for 10 or 20 minutes. And it was a lot of work, and I had to be really super intentional about it. And now in year 2 of this pandemic, my attention span is once again splintered. That potent mix of doom scrolling, numbing out on Instagram, nightly Netflix marathons. What role does screen time play in degrading our attention?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, you said something very important regarding your prior career and the way in which you successfully maneuvered through that set of challenges, right? And you were successful at it and you were capable of doing it. I would say that what you did through the course of that career context is train yourself to task switch in a very efficient manner. So that kind of, maybe this is going to require us to have a little bit of a journey into what I even mean when I use the term attention. So let me just say a couple of quick sentences because I think it'll get all the people listening to our conversation maybe more attuned to what I'm saying. So one way we can pay attention, which we might call focus, is this notion of kind of limiting, directing, willfully pointing that brain, our brain resource to whatever it is that we want to pay attention to, whatever it is that we want to focus on. And truly, at the brain level, at the behavioral level, we get crisper, clearer access to the information that we focus on, right? And I give the analogy or the metaphor, I guess, of a flashlight. So if we're in a darkened room, wherever it is that we direct that flashlight, we get privileged access. Very, very powerful thing to do. Now, I didn't say flashlights. I said flashlight because, frankly, this is a singular brain process, meaning we devote and constrain all of the brain's resources, kind of recalibrate it to privilege whatever we direct our attention toward. So in some sense...
in each hand.
Say it again?
I can't
just
have
one, not one in each hand, right? So in some sense, what you were doing is taking that flashlight, directing it toward one thing, and then redirecting it to another thing, and then redirecting it back. And the thing that probably allowed you to make those efficient switches was another brain system of attention called the alerting system. And this is very different than the flashlight. It's more, which is, broad, narrow, constrained, restrictive, whatever's we point to, we advantage, but everything else is sort of dimmed out. The other brain system, which I like to use the metaphor of like a floodlight or fog light even, just broad, and I have one above my garage, so I always think of this every time because it's kind of a motion sensitive one. So what it privileges is what is happening right now. It's privileging the moment. The information it cares about is the current state of things, but it's not selecting based on the type of information. So you're broad, receptive, alert, but you're not saying, I only should look at the right side of the screen or the left side of the screen, everything, right? And another way to think about this to really make it clear, because we all know this if we just remind ourselves of the different ways we pay attention. It's not about focus, but if you're driving down the road or walking and you see a yellow flashing light, it could be near a construction site or maybe a school, you know the mindset that you're in. It's like, okay, pay attention. But that pay attention is very different than, look at the words on the screen or listen to a particular voice. It's broad, receptive right now. What is occurring? Because at any moment, a child may walk across the street or a strange piece of equipment may end on the road. That is a very different brain system. So I just wanted to say that in some sense, what I think you were doing, and you did it probably very well, is you were focusing your flashlight, you were keeping your floodlight broad so that you could see, got to go over here now, got to go back. And you trained your mind to do that. Many of us can train our minds to get better and better at that. It is exhausting, by the way. It is quite exhausting to do it. And it sounds like, you may have experienced that this is a challenge, but I did it and I did it well. In some sense now, moving to the novel, you have to retrain yourself. And what you have to retrain yourself to do is, first of all, not have that pacing. The attentional cycling is not going to be as great. The pull of distracting information may be just as potent, though. But now it's not the other task you have to attend to. It's the thought that you have, right? Or I don't know, maybe your phone dings or something like that. There's always something that can pull you. And because you're so used to the switching, you might be prone to kind of respond to that. So I think that a good approach, and you probably did this when you were setting the timers you described, it's almost like if you're in a mindfulness practice and you get an itch on your face, you have a choice point, right? You know that your urge is to do the thing that's without any thought. Of course, you're going to scratch the itch. But in that moment, when you are dedicating yourself to pay attention to breath-related sensations, for example, and the itch arises, it's seen as a task-irrelevant distraction, but it's pulling on that flashlight. And then you have a choice to say, am I just going to go ahead and itch? Or will I acknowledge the presence of that feeling of that's pulling me, allow it to just pass away and keep my focus where it's going to be? So the floodlight acknowledged that itch, but it didn't take action. And that's part of that retraining process of all those thoughts, feelings, internal and external distractions that arise. We have to train ourselves to be tolerant of them, accepting of them, and not as easily pulled in a thoughtless, automatic way, which we won't do unless we actually dedicate ourselves to training the mind in that way. So I'm glad that you figured it out of how to do it. And I agree with you that part of the reason it's a challenge, again, is because all of these brain systems, both of the ones that we described, they're going to be more depleted and more prone to not functioning quite as well. So it's going to feel like a little bit more of a challenge, which might mean we have to up our training a bit.
Right. And I guess the great news is that the training is possible.
Exactly.
And it's, you've sort of come to this experience or this information that it can take as little as 12 minutes a day. Can you talk about what that 12-minute investment needs to look like?
Yeah. And, I would say it's not a given that it could have done anything for attention. In the field of brain science, in the field of, cognitive neuroscience, which is my area, and even neuroplasticity as a topic. I mean, we often hear that term, neuroplasticity, which is essentially our repeated experience and engagement in certain kinds of activities transforming the way the brain functions. And that's all we're talking about. So that's a propensity of mind that has been around forever. I think that's only the new part is that we can train it sort of for our betterment, and that can actually advantage our functioning. And we can track that with brain imaging. So we can see that repeatedly doing something that actually is better for us can change the brain in beneficial ways. So that's a real win. But the tricky part was, at least as it comes to attention, is that it was a slippery thing of like, well, how do you actually train for that? How do you actually improve attention? And we tried all kinds of things in my lab, frankly, because I was on kind of a hunt of like, how do we get this to work? And as was my field at that time. So, for example, things like gadgets, right? Light and sound devices. Maybe if we just kind of stimulate the brain, we might be able to get it to attend better. And frankly, in the short term, it may. In the long term, jury's still out if there's really anything at the technological level that's going to necessarily not just allow you to focus better, but allow you to refocus when you need to. That's a more subtle aspect. But anyway, I want to answer your question, but I did want to say that it's not a given that it would happen. And in addition to sort of the gadgets as the answer, the other thing that we and the field of research have looked at is brain training games that are available all over the place. You can download them on your phone, and they're little games that you can play that are attention games, memory games. There's many commercially available products like this. So people kind of in the field went kind of nuts over this and said, let's just give people these brain training games. And then, they're attentional games, so they'll engage attention, and then we'll test to see how much their attention improves. Well, the first thing that people did is they gave people this kind of, let's say, video game that you play and had them play the video game over, let's say, 30 days. And yes, you got way better playing the video game for many days in a row. Like your score would just go up and up and up. So now the real test is how generalizable is the benefit to your attention? Like you got better at that specific game, but if I change features of the game, not yet even saying if I change to look to see if it impacts the person's life, we're not even there yet. Just I'll do another experiment where I'll test and I'll change all the X's to O's, or I'll change the green things to red things. And now I have them do the same thing, which is essentially the same game. What happens? Does it transfer over to this similar but not same context? People start falling apart. So like you're up and up and up. Now you tweak certain parameters, boop, they're back down. So that posed a big challenge. It's like the brain is smart in the sense that it will get better, but it's very specific. It's not going to generalize that benefit in the same way we were talking about with you a moment ago when you had that job where you had to switch. You were great at switching among those things. But now if I put you in a fast food restaurant and you had to do also a lot of switching, very different set of circumstances, you probably couldn't just immediately step into switching because it's a different context. So that was sort of the holy grail of attention training, is like, can you go from a context that's a training environment to something that's so different and see a benefit? And in my mind, it was like unlikely to work that we could get people to close their eyes, sit by themselves in a room, close their eyes, pay attention to their breath, or do a whole host of other mindfulness practices, and then come into the lab and get evaluated on tasks that were like, look at the 3 and the other digits and press the number and all kinds of other things that we were going to do. It's a pretty big leap to go from focusing in that way but we saw benefits, which was the exciting thing. People got better on that same task. And that was super exciting because that meant maybe we're tapping into something that's generalizable. So anyway, so knowing that we could do this, and some of the first studies that we ever did, to answer your question about the 12 minutes, I wanted to go big in the sense that, nobody had ever really tried this to bring the kind of tools of cognitive neuroscience to evaluating attention. So I'm like, let's do something where if there was ever a chance that there was going to be a benefit, this would probably be it. So like kind of Olympic level effort in the training. So we partnered with a month-long retreat that happened at Shambhala Mountain Center. People, voluntarily signed up to do 30 days of what's called the Dathun and practiced mindfulness-based practices for the entire time. And I'm like, if we don't get it here, it's like never going to show up. And sure enough, they did. We found beneficial effects that task performance increased on a variety of tasks, which we've even published on. But that's not reasonable for most people to do. Most of us cannot go, forget about a month-long retreat, a day-long retreat's even tricky. And you certainly can't have this be like your daily lifestyle. And I was always thinking about mindfulness in the more of the context of if attentional exercise is something that is possible, well, then you should be able to do something daily and it should be a reasonable dose. So that's what I was on the hunt for. So luckily for us, when we started this work and wanted to move it from sort of the retreat context to everyday life, we were able to lean on a very well-developed program. And this was the early 2000s, John Kabat-Zinn's Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. Wonderful program. There's now literally thousands of studies that have looked at this, and it is the gold standard for really mindfulness training in the clinical and kind of healthcare context and many other kind of contexts. And it requires about 8 weeks of training and 45 minutes a day of daily practice. So because that's great, that's better than trying to go away for a month-long retreat. I mean, more feasible, and many people are able to do this and benefit from this. But remember the kinds of populations I told you we wanted to work with. Time pressured, performance pressured, and we wanted to work with them in the height of their stress levels being intensive. So what we did, and it gets directly to your question, is we said, okay, fine, 45 minutes may be too long. Let's give them 30. Just in the very first experiment we did. Not many people did 30 minutes. And because it was the research context, we said, tell us what you actually did. Because there was quite a lot of variability. Some people really benefited when we tracked them over 8 weeks. Some people benefited, some people didn't. So I was curious, what's the sweet spot? Is there some kind of what we might call dose response, like those that practiced more benefited more? Yes, the answer is yes. Those that practice more benefited more. But beyond that, I wanted to know, what's the threshold? And that threshold ended up being, in one of those first studies, about 12 minutes. So if they practiced about 12 minutes a day that they volunteered on their own or more, they benefited. If they practiced less, we didn't consistently see benefits. So then in the follow-up studies, we actually gave them 12-minute guided practices to see. And now people were willing to do it. They weren't blowing it off. They weren't giving up. And the more days a week they did, the more they benefited, with about 3 to 5 being the sweet spot for that. So that's where that prescription comes from. I didn't do a study, and I actually haven't seen any that have been done that systematically, where you titrate giving people different amounts. It sounds like a great idea, but when you're dealing with human beings and mindfulness practice, just because you tell somebody to practice 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you really don't know. So this is what we'd call a data emergent project. We just give people something to do, and then we see, what does the data tell us reliably tends to show benefits. So in the 12 minutes, what we do is the whole host, sort of the standard canon of mindfulness practices: mindfulness of breathing, body scan, open monitoring, and loving kindness practice. And when we offer those sort of week by week, and then interleave some of the practices as well. And doing that reliably, I would say now, I would say 12 minutes or more, 3 to 5 times a week, we see beneficial effects in these high demand groups for their attention.
How exciting was that for you?
It was super exciting and kind of surprising, right? The first level of surprise was, this is kind of amazing that people are able to train their mind, and then we see it in this laboratory setting. It's not a given, and it's been quite a quandary. I mean, even if you think you can train the brain, it's not obvious how you might do that.
Right. Although when I reflect on my own experience, I think I was training my brain to be distracted. So why couldn't I
Yeah.
also
Say it
train it
again.
the other way? Well, it seems to me that I spent a long time in my career training my brain to be distractible.
Yeah, I would say, I would put it in a better light. I would say you were training your brain to be agile to the demands that you had,
I
right?
appreciate the reframe.
No, really, because you were really tuned to what you had to do next. And a lot of us have to do that for our careers. It's just that we feel crippled by an inability to stay stable when we don't want to be always switching around. There is sort of this heightened sensitivity we have toward what the demand may be. And remember back to that notion of the flashlight that I was providing. So the flashlight, we can devote it and direct it willfully. But the other thing about this precious brain resource is that it gets yanked. It just gets yanked. So even if you're in a darkened room, think back to that sort of context, and you hear some weird sound behind you, boop, you're going to flip that flashlight and see what the heck is going on. Because attention, it ends up, is the success story of our evolution. It allowed us to survive and advantaged things that would privilege our survival. So something potentially threatening, of course you should drop everything and pay attention to that. Or novel, or bright shiny thing, or something enticing. There's all these different things that our brain has been sort of attuned to that we should always flip the flashlight to. That's what is the distractibility, is that we don't want to be on a group text chain when we should be writing a report. How do we get ourselves to not do that? And I think that the answer is the same whether it was you trying to write a novel or somebody else in their life now just wanting to be able to hold their own attention, to know that there is this constant battle going on, and to know that noticing that your mind is somewhere that you don't want it to be, it's not a failure, it's a win. It's frankly the only win you've got. If you didn't even know that your mind was somewhere else, there's no chance that you're going to be able to bring it back. I think that's a really powerful and useful reframe. If you can catch where that flashlight is before it's 2 hours deep into the group text about a trip you may all take 6 months from now, if you can notice the tug of your phone and say, flashlight's moving in the direction I don't want it to, boop, bring it back, right? The earlier we can attune ourselves to noticing our own mind wandering, the better we can be at redirecting it back. So all of these things, this capacity to focus when we want to, notice when we're not focused, and then redirect back are trainable as far as we can tell. And we can get better and better at tuning up how distracted we need to be before we can kind of wake up to the fact that we are, to get back on track.
And of course, that's what we're doing in those mindfulness meditation practices that you've used in your lab.
That's right. That's exactly what we're doing. And I think that, I was saying this earlier, but I really mean it. Having access to practice, having access to a community that likes to practice, values it, it's non-trivial. It makes a big difference. In the same way that, if you wanted to pick up a new running habit or walking habit, being around a community of people that care about that activity can really make a difference. And then kind of rekindling the importance and value in your life, that this is not something you can coast on. Just in the same way a marathon runner can't train for a marathon and think, I'm good for the rest of my life, I can run a marathon whenever I want. No way, right? Even if you trained up for it, if you just become a couch potato for the next 6 months, forget it. You're not going to be able to just hop back in. Now, you may be better able to kind of regain some of those functions faster, but you need to have some kind of daily ramp up and regimen to stay physically fit, and the mind is no different.
I want to ask you, before we turn to audience questions, I want to ask you quickly about ADHD. This is no doubt anecdotal, but I feel like over the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic, I saw a big increase in both people I know and then people I encounter on the internet writing about finding that they have ADHD or at least ADHD symptoms. And there seems to be an increase in that. And I just wonder what you say about that.
Makes complete sense to me. In some sense, attention deficit is exactly what I started out talking about with you, right? This notion that VUCA circumstances, stress, threat, poor mood, are going to disable and degrade attention. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, we talked about two systems already, the flashlight and the floodlight. There's a third system, something called executive control, I call it the juggler, because frankly, just like the executive of a company, this system's job is to ensure, and really we use that term executive for that reason. It's like the same as a corporate executive. This system's job is to ensure that our goals and our behavior align, kind of moment by moment. And in order to do that, the executive function system means to maintain what the goals are. What am I supposed to be doing right now? It allows us to update. Oh, there's new information. Maybe don't have that same goal. Do it differently, or don't do it. Inhibit behavior that doesn't align with the goal, so that we're not off doing the wrong thing. Get us back on track, and then shift, just like you were doing when you were doing this task switching. Right? Executive control was really allowing you to say, the goal right now is to be agile and receptive to what's going on. So that brain system, it's a juggler because it's kind of keeping all the balls in the air. So now all three of these systems, we know how they function. We know how they function well. And we also know how they function not well. So for example, that flashlight would be when it's not always directing to where you want it to go, but it's kind of off wherever. Or it can't even constrain itself to be a flashlight, sort of like fractured light. Or the floodlight could be overly bright so that everything feels like this caution, hypervigilant kind of orientation, which leads to, is tied to anxiety, for example. And then the juggler, the balls will drop. You can't keep your goals in mind. Like, we can see how each of these systems may function very well and not so well. And the thing that drives them down are the factors that we just discussed. So the fact that more people are reporting feeling ADD-like makes sense to me, because in many ways, they probably are getting driven down. I mean, this notion of feeling a cognitive fog, there's nothing wrong with that. It's unfortunate and it's painful, but it's real. It's not imagined. And all I would say is, when it becomes a clinical diagnosis, that's essentially when it's so problematic that it's affecting your daily functioning. And then I think you do need to get some real professional support. But just to keep in mind that it's not just any one of these systems. Attention dysregulation, attentional dysfunction could be some level of set points and interactions between these systems. So I think that it's good for people to understand the way that attention works. And even if they say, I feel like my attention's not working so well, look to the other systems. How are they doing? To kind of normalize and give yourself a sense. I mean, I really think that it's important not to kind of get so self-deprecating regarding our attention, because it doesn't serve us, frankly. It's another source of distraction. And it's a very normal way the brain is responding. And we can train it to get better. So I'd rather people orient toward what the wins are that are within our control.
And another aspect of mindfulness meditation, right? To come back, bring your focus back with compassion. There's no sense berating yourself for being...
Absolutely. With compassion, with kindness, but while befriending yourself, that this is done in a manner to help you live your life better and more fully.
Amishi, I know what's at stake for me personally when my focus is shot. It means I spend more hours at my desk, which means my body and my mind both feel worse at the end of it. What are the stakes, for all of us on a sort of socio-cultural scale? What's at stake when so many of us are, as you say, like missing 50% of what's happening?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, the 50%, we don't want the number to dip above that. We don't have to go above that, because I think that's when we really get it. It's already hard enough when we miss a lot of our moments, but under certain circumstances, it's going to be worse. And I just like the way you asked the question, because it's not just us as individuals. It is a collective impact that this is having and will continue to have. And when we don't have our collective eye on the ball, things go haywire. And frankly, we're in a real crisis moment about some things right now. So for example, climate crisis. Like, we cannot be so fractured, both within ourselves and in our ability to interact with others. Because frankly, I don't know if I said this, but our attention is needed not just for our own ability to think. I mean, really, truly, it's like if you have an idea and you're pursuing a thought, you've pointed your flashlight to actually kind of hyperlink it to other concepts. We need our attention to do that, but we also need it to feel and regulate our emotions. And the third thing is we need our attention to connect. We direct that flashlight toward other people. We have the floodlight available to see what's happening in our environment and with the interactions we have. Our juggler cares about the interactions and the management of goals tied to our interactions with other people. So all of these things suggest that when our individual attention systems are compromised because of so many different things, the group's ability to solve big problems, emergent problems we haven't even experienced yet, but we're going to, is going to be compromised. So everything that plays out in our own lives, we're going to start seeing at a global scale. So I don't see this as I don't mind the term self-care, but this is mandatory training. We need to, not mandatory in the sense that it should be imposed on people, but we need to take it upon ourselves to kind of up-level our ability to have access to our own mind because the world needs it. We need it in our own lives, but the world needs it. So climate crisis is one example, but there's another one that I think I wanted to mention. And I did write an article in Mindful about this. The consequences that I think do contribute to social unrest and to political divisiveness, and this may be a surprise to many people, we need our attention to know what we should believe. Now that sounds kind of weird, like what? But it ends up that the brain, for the most part, and this is still being actively debated, but there are plenty of studies now that suggest that the default of the brain is to believe information first, meaning if you hear it, you will believe it. And then attention allows you to deliberate whether the thing you believe should be unbelieved. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you are presented with ideas and then decide which ones you want to believe. The default is believe and then unbelieve. Now, why would that be? Well, because it ends up that our comprehension system is it's built off of our perceptual system. So seeing is believing. I see your face. I don't think it's an imagination of my mind. I see a cup. I think it's reality. Perception defaults to believing. Comprehension does too. So now all of a sudden, we're globally scattered. Our attention is shot. Stuff is being thrown at us. And we've lost the capacity to evaluate in the same manner. It's worse because now we have siloed communication because of the social media algorithms that are further fracturing us. So we don't even have a chance to kind of bounce ideas off of people that might be more likely to unbelieve things that we are less likely to unbelieve. So I just do think that attention is not just a nice to have, it's a must have at the individual level and frankly for our collective good and our collective survival.
Thank you for that. Those are high stakes. I appreciate it as a person who's very externally motivated by the needs of others. Yeah. I'm convinced. All right, I want to bring in some questions from our audience here. And so this person wonders if you can speak to any new research projects or findings that are coming out related to mindfulness and attention.
Near and dear to my heart. So, I think that the good news is now we're at the point where we're not doing a single study or a couple of studies. We're taking a look at the research that's occurred already, and we're doing what's called meta-analysis, an aggregate of all the studies, and then an analysis of meta-analyses. So the rigor with which we're able to evaluate and interrogate research findings is growing. And the good news is even in those meta-analyses of meta-analyses, we're finding that yes, indeed, attention does seem to be something that has benefited. For my lab, I think that it would depend on the researcher that you ask what the most exciting or innovative pieces are. But from my lab, the things that are exciting are related to not only that attention is benefited, but strategies that are scalable and accessible to allow people better access to a lot of these practices. So as most people probably know, there's a proliferation of apps that are available for mindfulness. So what is known about the benefits of engaging in practice with a trained trainer, without a trained trainer, on your own? And I think that's the sort of the next generation of questions that we're asking, and that we will be getting answers to shortly. I'll just give you from my own lab a paper that we published recently that I'm very excited about, was asking about scalability. So we trained a group of military spouses. And the reason we did this, frankly, was because every time we trained service members, the first thing they said is, get this to my spouse. I'm about to be deployed. My spouse is going to be here holding down the fort, working a full-time job, guiding the family. And so we offered mindfulness training to spouses. And one of the things that the spouses said is, it's great, it's helpful. I learned the practices, but you just don't know the challenges of my life. And it would help me to actually be able to have somebody who knew what the circumstances were to train other people. And so we trained a group of spouses to deliver it to other spouses. Now, these are not professional trainers. And these spouses didn't know anything about mindfulness before they started. In a 10-week period of time, we were able to ramp them up to deliver the training to other spouses. And the paper that just came out looks at the results on those spouses that they delivered it to. And we found beneficial effects. We found that, indeed, their psychological health was improved. Their self-reported stress levels were reduced. And for those that practiced reliably, they saw benefits to their attention. So that's sort of where our energy is right now, is offering it to different kinds of groups, looking at train the trainer modalities, and then looking at how this affects performance and well-being.
Thank you for that. That is exciting. Another question, is there a connection between distractibility and mental health or anxiety?
Oh, I think the person asking knows the answer. Yes, there certainly is. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Oftentimes when people think about psychological health and attention, it's sort of like, yeah, you've got this cognitive system and then you got the emotional system, and they're just separate from each other. Not true at all. We know that that kind of siloing of the mind is usually not correct. But it ends up that oftentimes what are perceived as solely psychological disorders having to do with mood are tied to disorders of attention. So in some sense, we can think of something like depression, where it's a flashlight that is overly prioritizing and kind of yanked by depressogenic thought. It's like you can't pull it away, and you end up in these ruminative loops. So the more we can train individuals that suffer from depression of noticing those tendencies of mind, to be able to kind of broaden out and see that that negative content doesn't need to yank the flashlight, but can be experienced and it will fade away, sort of this open monitoring approach. It can really help, because now the flashlight isn't so prone to privileging that kind of mental content. Or in the context, the person mentioned anxiety, in the context of the floodlight. Oftentimes, disorders like anxiety and PTSD have an overly active floodlight. Like the sensitivity to be broad and kind of on edge is greater. So in that case, you might do something essentially very similar, where you're going to take a distanced perspective, for example, something called decentering. You're going to defuse yourself from the content that's arising to kind of dial down the brightness of that floodlight. Now, I'm speaking in very metaphorical terms, and I'm doing that just because our time is short and I can't give you the 10 papers to read, but know that there are people taking a serious look at psychological disorders, the relationship to mindfulness and the relationship to attentional dysfunction, to connect the dots. And so far, we know that for intractable depression, mindfulness-based approaches are very, very beneficial. Same thing with anxiety. So I just wanted to say that absolutely, for the clinical level, these matter. Distractibility matters. But the solutions seem to be those that all of us, even if we don't have a clinical level disorder, we can all benefit from to improve our well-being and better manage the distractions that we feel right now compel our mind to behave in ways that is not supporting us.
Here's a question from someone who's absolutely picking up on the metaphors that you're using. Hannah wonders, is there any data that suggests whether focused training, flashlight, helps us maintain a more natural, broader awareness, or the fog light?
Even at the most granular level, when we think of mindfulness practices, we're not tapping into only one system. So let's just think about what we might call a focused practice, a focused attention practice. And there are categories of practices that we'd call concentrative attention practices. So like mindfulness of the breath, where and this is, I actually call this practice the find your flashlight practice, because I'm trying to emphasize a different aspect that might actually be the secret sauce in some sense. So the intention is to focus on breath-related sensations. That's what the executive system says is the goal for the practice. That's what you're going to do. Pay attention to breath-related sensations. Take something vivid, take the flashlight, point it there, keep it there. Now, I already said that 50% of our waking moments, our mind is not on the task at hand. Attentional cycling, distractibility, very natural. So focusing is, of course, the primary instruction. But the next part of the instruction is notice. Notice when your mind has wandered away. And it's not, no, if you happen to be some weird person whose mind wanders, because it really shouldn't, so you're bad if your mind wanders, that's not the instruction. The instruction is notice when your mind wanders away, because it will. It just will. It's the nature of the mind. In fact, I've gotten to the point where it's like I have a little bit of heartfulness every time my mind wanders, because there's so many new and exciting reasons that we're learning that mind wandering may be actually tied to memory formation. So kind of feel good about it. Like, oh, there's my mind doing what it does, wandering away. So it's focus, notice when your mind wanders. And then the third part of the instruction, which is exactly what we were saying before, engaging executive control. If you're not on the task at hand, redirect it back. So focus, notice, redirect is tapping into all three systems of attention. And in some sense, I think that we cultivate that broadening component by really tapping into finding our flashlight. In the book, I actually describe other practices that are part of the kind of normal canon of mindfulness, where we're really going to be able to practice with the floodlight a little bit more, open monitoring practices. But elements of both focusing, noticing, and kind of holding the goal in mind are part of, I think, every mindfulness practice, at least that I've learned about and that I encourage other people to practice.
For that. This person wonders, what is your experience with organizational buy-in and investment in healthcare to prioritize mindfulness to promote physician retention?
Wow, very specific question. Mm-hmm. Watch the Mindful Healthcare Summit. That's the first thing I'd say, because we had a very interesting, actually, Stephanie guided that conversation, right? You guided this very interesting conversation with me and former Surgeon General of the Army. That topic definitely came up across multiple sessions. I think the main thing to do in terms of buy-in is think about, first of all, we're not at the starting point right now. There's an entire literature that people can lean on. Mm-hmm. We know about workplace mindfulness training. We know even about sort of the actuarial and financial implications of introducing mindfulness in many contexts. So, I think the real challenge is in terms of institutional engagement is finding the right entry point, and then having leaders that understand enough to give it a try. So I don't know if I'm going to answer the person's specific question, but thankfully you're not at a moment where you're doing this alone. I mean, frankly, that was a lot of the moments I felt in the early days of this enterprise, is people that were offering it in education or healthcare, or for me, the military, we were alone. Now there's a community of people that you can lean on. There are organizations that are devoted to exploring the utility of these practices in the healthcare setting for physicians, for example. So start by seeking out others that have already done this as sort of mentors and guides to see how they can help guide you to do it in your own specific context where you may be experiencing challenge.
We just have a few minutes left, and we have a few more questions, so we'll try to squeak them in. In your experience working with soldiers and the military, what kinds of practices did you use to introduce them to mindfulness? Which mindfulness practices are some of the go-to practices for the high-stress populations you serve?
Right. So because the starting point for a lot of our work was on what I would consider the most empirically well-studied sort of civilian program, if you will, mindfulness-based stress reduction, the options that we chose from as we were thinking about how to offer it to military service members came from that suite of practices. And the four that I mentioned have comprised most of the programs that we have studied in the lab. So, and these happen to be the four practices that I describe in the book as well. We're not having people necessarily, as they're learning them, decide whether they're going to practice or not. It's part of the program. So mindfulness of breathing or focused attention practices, body scan, open monitoring, and loving kindness are all part of the 4-week repertoire that we offer. After the 4 weeks, and right now I'm speaking about a program called Mindfulness-Based Attention Training that I co-developed with my colleague Scott Rogers that we have now studied in multiple contexts. But after the 4 weeks, we kind of say, do what you want. Pick the practice that you want. And in a recent study, a collaboration actually with Army researchers, we were very curious. What do people pick? to my surprise, these were boot camp soldiers. Like, they weren't even soldiers yet, they're cadets. The one that they tended to like a lot was the loving kindness practice. And I think there's a whole bunch of things we could say about that, but it is very interesting. So basically, I would say the mindfulness-based stress reduction suite is our go-to, and a subset of those tend to work quite well as a kind of enterprise of practices together.
Wonderful. Have you tried these strategies for young children and their families to prevent mental health difficulties in the population?
I have not, but thankfully, there's a whole lot of people that have. And I think we're starting to find evidence that mindfulness training offered in the educational context for students and in the kind of family dynamics context we're finding beneficial results. It's just a matter of like the specifics, right? So again, we're not at the point where we're doing a study or two. Now we're doing meta-analyses, and sometimes meta-analyses of meta-analyses. The research is still amassing, but overall, I would say the evidence is good in terms of benefiting students' psychological health. And I mean like K through 12 kind of student context. Family dynamics, meaning the relationships between parents with each other, child-parent relationships, and even classroom cohesion, so that the kind of contagion of the benefits that you see are proliferating. But yes, absolutely, there's a lot of great work on that that's being done. And I even think Mindful's done a couple of articles on kind of reviewing the nature of mindfulness in the context of development, children, families, and education. So there's plenty to see out there.
Amishi, let me ask you one last question before I let you go. I'm curious about how your own practice has changed through your research and through the writing of this book.
Oh, wow. I would say the way my practice has changed is the same way I hope it will for everybody. So it's been fun for me in the journey of writing the book. I mean, the first thing I'll say is I would have never encountered mindfulness training or decided to practice it if it weren't for a dear colleague, Richie Davidson, who said it at a conference, as a symposium that I was attending. So I was not sort of prone to wanting to explore this. I would say I was a real skeptic. Thankfully, I was open enough because I respected him greatly to give it a try, and it changed everything about my life and frankly pivoted my research program in this direction. So it's been quite a journey. The reason I wanted to write the book in the first place is because I felt that we were at the point where we'd amassed enough evidence that we could actually offer it to not just these certain kinds of professions, but all of us. And I wanted to make it accessible for people that maybe had never heard about it, mindfulness before. But the happy surprise for me has been that, yes, I think that people that had never heard of mindfulness or considered it, like me at the early stages of my journey with mindfulness, are becoming more curious and understanding the value of training our attention. But the kind of special surprise for me has been working with and hearing from people that are long-term practitioners that feel like hearing about this perspective of attention and attention training, not just the narrowing, but the broadening and the relationship to our emotions, really beneficial. So my practice is basically, it's like a daily reminder. When I hear from other people, and just in the journey of writing this book, it reminded me of all the reasons that this is beneficial for the people that decide to engage in it, and that it can benefit me as well. And I should do it, because talking about it and doing it are two different things. So just get on the mat, close your eyes, practice.
Amishi, it's been such a pleasure to have you here for this conversation. Huge congratulations on this book, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
You can read an excerpt from Peak Mind in the December issue of Mindful or at mindful.org, and you will find much more by and about Dr. Amishi Jha on mindful.org. If you enjoyed this episode of Real Mindful, we would love it if you would leave us a review. You can do that wherever you find your favorite podcasts, and your review helps other listeners decide whether Real Mindful might be right for them. We'd love to hear from you as well. You can write to us about what you heard on the show today, or suggest a topic or guest for a future episode. You can write to us anytime at yourwords@mindful.org. I should note, too, that we have a weekly practice podcast called 12-Minute Meditation. And as you heard Amishi say, and as the title of her book indicates, 12 minutes a day is enough to yield benefits like increased focus, clarity, calm, and compassion. And we want all of that and more for you. So each week we deliver a fresh mindfulness practice right into your ears from a leading mindfulness expert. And you can subscribe to 12-Minute Meditation wherever fine podcasts are found. We'll be back soon with another episode of Real Mindful. Till then, as Amishi Jha says, just get on your mat, close your eyes, practice.